November 1945, after 6 years of World War, the conflict has finally come to an end. While Britain rejoices, it is a country in ruin, horrified at the atrocities committed by the Nazis, and the public are still trying to wrap their heads around the device that caused the Japanese to surrender. It was at this time a film came out of Ealing Studios that, in my mind, is one of the greatest horror films ever made, and quietly set the standard for the horror anthology, or the portmanteau film, for decades to come. Dead of Night was filmed in the final months of the war and is an interesting choice for a studio that had been at the forefront of war propaganda. In the early days of the conflict, when the government closed down all places of entertainment, it was producer Michael Balkin that led a protest to reopen them, emphasising the importance that film had in morality and propaganda. So this film came out of left field for the studio and would be somewhat bewildering to an audience. Despite Britain having a lengthy, esteemed literary history with the horror or terror genre, it never seemed to find the same successes when it came to film, failing to embrace the macabre as Hollywood or Germany had done. In fact, the British film industry almost seemed contemptuous of it, with the work of German horror masterpieces being shown in art houses and American horror causing controversy, so much so there was a brief ban on the genre after the production of Freaks. There were a few British productions like the Victorian melodramas of Tod Slaughter or The Ghoul starring Boris Karloff, and even Bela Lugosi was brought over to appear in an early Hammer film, 1935's The Mystery of the Marie Celeste. By the time of the war being declared, the genre in Britain was dead and there would be no British horror films allowed throughout the conflict. So why would Ealing, as its first post-war release, decide upon a genre that was not familiar to the British industry? I think the portmanteau structure was appealing, a group of people coming together and sharing their experiences. The collective or the community are important in Ealing films. Throughout the war and after, we come together to protect and rebuild ourselves, to make sense of the world. Even with Dead of Night, the studio seemed to be coming together as a collective. The cast were familiar to British audiences, there were Ealing regulars. Also, Balkin brought together his best writers and 4 Ealing directors, Basil Dearden, Alberto Cavalcanti, Robert Hamer and Charles Crichton. It wasn't the first time Ealing, a film studio we now associate with quirky comedies, had tread on a dark path. The 1942 film Went the Day Well is the story of Nazis invading a small English village and is reminiscent of a psychological thriller where the jovial wealthy squire is a traitor and the down-to-earth townsfolk are heroes. The horror or supernatural anthology was not a new formula in cinema. In the silent era, Germany had produced waxworks. In the States, the anthology structure was familiar with films such as Griffith's Intolerance and the supernatural Flesh and Fantasy. The anthology structure also found increasing favour because of its short episodic nature in an audience that had increasingly been consuming broadcast media. The wartime audience rediscovered tales of thrilling terror through radio. In Britain, Appointment with Fear and in the United States, Suspense were amongst the most popular shows ever to hit the airwaves, with top stars chomping at the bit to perform chilling tales by prolific writers. There is also a rustic comfort to gathering around a fire and telling tales of the supernatural, especially at a time when the populace had faced a real fear of air raids or losing loved ones, when there's a blackout and there's nothing to do but to invent fears. Dead of Night opens with architect Walter Craig, played by Mervyn Johns, arriving at the rural pilgrim's cottage at the request of the owner Elliot Foley. Immediately, Craig's manner is one of confusion. He has never met Foley or been at the cottage. However, upon entering the house and meeting the assembled guests, all of whom are strangers to him, Craig declares that he has met them all at the same location in a recurring dream. The group are friendly and seem keen to put Craig at ease. One of the guests is German psychoanalyst Dr. Van Straten, who tries to dismiss Craig's growing concern that something awful is going to happen and persuades him to stay and face his fear rather than run as he wants to do. Attempting to set him at ease and to test Van Straten's logic, the other guests entertain and discuss their experiences with the uncanny and supernatural. Mervyn Johns as Walter Craig is truly excellent, going from a groggy bewilderment to an increasing apprehension. His performance, along with Basil Dearden's direction, keeps us intrigued with this framing device. He is easily persuaded to stay, and it is clear he is unable to actually think clearly. This is a recurring theme throughout the film. We settle down to listen to 5 mysterious tales, the first of which is told by Hugh Granger, played by Anthony Baird, and is known as the Hearse Driver. Like the framing story, this story is directed by Basil Dearden and is based on the 1906 story The Bus Conductor by E.F. Benson. It's very simple and short, a mere appetizer for what is to come. Granger is a racing driver recovering from an accident in hospital and has a ghostly premonition about his own demise. The segment still has its eerie moments, especially when night suddenly becomes day and there's silence on the soundtrack. This simple technique reminds me of what Jack Clayton would latterly do in 1961's The Innocents, using silence, daylight and birdsong to capture an eerie ambience. Ealing and Hammer regular character actor Miles Malleson also makes a memorable appearance. Sally, a teenage visitor at Pilgrim's Cottage, then tells of her supernatural experience at a Christmas party. This section is directed by Cavalcanti and written by Hitchcock collaborator Angus MacPhail. This is a typical ghost story, complete with a large Victorian house full of jovial children, a roaring fire and dark passages, tapping into the old and for a 1940s audience familiar English tradition of telling a ghost story at Christmas. Sally Ann Howes, who modern audiences may recognise as truly scrumptious from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, is separated from the rest of the party during a variation of hide and seek and finds a lone weeping child hidden in the back room. He tells the girl that he is Francis Kent and is abused by his older sister Constance. This story has its basis in fact, when in 1860, 16-year-old Constance Kent was accused and stood trial for brutally murdering her 4-year-old brother. The case was one of the great national sensations of the Victorian period, controversial as a young wealthy girl was accused by a working class detective, destroying the reputation of the police and detectives for decades. As it turned out, Constance would confess and was trialled and imprisoned for 20 years. Constance Kent would live to be 100 and died the year before the release of Dead of Night. In the film, the oblivious Sally comforts the little boy, singing him to sleep before returning to the party, where she is informed that Francis is in fact the name of a child that had been murdered by his sister 80 years previously. Sally attempts to remain constrained but is stiff and confused before breaking into hysterics. As with the conclusion of each story, we return to Pilgrim's Cottage and Van Straten attempts to explain each experience away, though he can never quite manage to dismiss the supernatural. We are also given a little bit more information about Craig's dream, though he continues to remain perplexed and vague. Unlike some other portmanteaus, the linking story keeps the audience engaged. There is no lull. The third story is told by Joan Cortland, played by Googie Withers, and is based on an original story by John Baines and directed by Robert Hamer. Withers tells the story of a mirror that she has given to her new husband Peter as a gift. Unbeknownst to her, when Peter looks into it, his reflection shows him not standing in his bright modern London flat, but in a very different, dark, Gothic bedroom, complete with an ornate 4-poster bed and a fire burning in the grate. Increasingly worried about his mental state, Peter confesses his concerns to Joan before she helps him to see the actual reflection by grasping his hand, her love and support bringing him back to reality. Things appear to be fine until Joan leaves for the weekend, and with Peter alone, the mirror once again reflects the mysterious room back at him. but this time it draws him into the world. Meanwhile, Joan discovers the origin of this piece from the man who sold it to her, that it once belonged to Francis Etherington, a crazed 19th century landowner that murdered his wife in a fit of jealousy before cutting his throat in front of the mirror. She quickly returns to Peter to realise that the personality of Etherington has possessed her husband, and in a possessive rage he attempts to murder Joan before she saves them both by destroying the mirror. Mirrors have a long history in horror cinema, from being used as a metaphor for a character to look into one's soul or give a jump scare, or even to see a dual personality on screen, a doppelganger. Even at the start of the film, Sally says,
"Perhaps it's like the Redgreave's dream in Alice Through the Looking Glass.
None of us exist at all. We're nothing but characters in Mr. Craig's dream."
Yet Peter sees himself as part of the past. Like Sally in the previous story, both briefly time jumped into a Victorian tableau, a part of history when the British Empire was at its height. But it's a dark, evil, violent place, and it's upsetting to dwell upon it. It's dangerous to emulate or mirror it. With Joan's story, we note that each tale is gradually becoming more sinister and the stakes are raised, and we are given a sort of respite with the fourth fable, known as The Golfer's Story by Elliot, owner of the cottage. Very loosely based on an H.G. Wells story titled The Inexperienced Ghost. This is a light comedic story and is often considered the weakest, so much so that it was cut from the American release of the film. This is directed by Charles Crichton, who would go on to have a successful career directing Ealing comedies and various television shows. His final film was A Fish Called Wanda in 1988. Two obsessive golfers, Potter and Parrot, decide to play a round to win the hand of Mary, the woman they both desire. When Parrot cheats to win the game, Potter walks into the lake committing suicide, only to return from the dead before the marriage to inform his friend that he has discovered his treachery and will continue to haunt him unless he gives up Mary and golf.
We'll have to give up golf.
Give up golf?
They come to an agreement, but when Potter tries to return to the afterlife, he can't because he's forgot how to. And in the end, Parrot inadvertently disappears into the afterlife, leaving Potter with the bride, basically engaging in a spectral wife swap. It's silly, makes no sense, but it's a punchline to a silly joke. Having previously appeared as similar characters in Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes, Basil Radford and Naunton Wayne regularly teamed up as an unofficial double act, portraying characters of Little Englanders. In Dead of Night, their obsession for golf comes before Mary, who's a comical prop more than a character. Their love for golf comes before their own lives. It's a hint at the comedy that Ealing would eventually produce later in the decade, so it's quintessentially British, and I think it has a quirky charm, though I understand horror fans' disdain for it. From a structural point of view, I also feel the golfing story is a breather between the haunted mirror and the final tale, the most celebrated and terrifying, the Ventriloquist's dummy. Once again directed by Cavalcanti with an original story by John Baines. The final story is told by Dr. Van Straten, who feels obliged to share after he has been asked to give his opinion, only to be repeatedly dismissed. Based upon one of his cases, this tale starts in a glitzy Parisian nightclub where Sylvester Keyes, a successful American ventriloquist, watches fellow ventriloquist Maxwell Frere and his dummy Hugo. From the viewpoint of the audience, this initially seems like a standard routine, until the pair are made aware of Sylvester's presence in the audience, causing Hugo to propose joining up with the other man. Maxwell visibly becomes tense, eventually slapping Hugo in the face after one insult too many. When Sylvester visits Maxwell backstage in a gesture of comradeship, he is startled to realise that the dysfunctional relationship isn't part of the act and continues behind closed doors. Presuming Maxwell is disturbed, Sylvester flees, only to meet him again months later. After a drunken altercation, Sylvester helps Maxwell and his dummy back to the hotel, where Hugo once again suggests dumping Maxwell and teaming up with Sylvester. The latter presumes this is yet another performance from Maxwell. Later in the night, he is awoken by an hysterical Maxwell, who demands where Hugo is. A furious Sylvester denies all knowledge of the disappearance, just as Maxwell finds Hugo in the stunned Sylvester's room. In a deranged fury, Maxwell shoots the American. Van Straten feels confronting Maxwell with Hugo will snap him out of his delusion, but the dummy once again antagonises Ventriloquist, and much to Van Straten's horror, Maxwell brutally destroys or murders Hugo. In the closing moments of this story, Maxwell, mostly unresponsive, is confronted with the wounded Sylvester. There's a flicker of recognition in his eyes as a ghastly smile spreads across his face, and with Hugo's voice, he greets his former rival.
Why, hello, Sylvester. I've been waiting for you.
The idea of a possessed doll is a staple in horror, from Chucky to Annabelle, and this story would be remade for The Twilight Zone, as well as Richard Attenborough's 1978 film Magic with Anthony Hopkins. The subject of the disturbed ventriloquist had also been done with 1929's The Great Gabbo with Erich von Stroheim, but Dead of Night is the first to hint at a possible supernatural explanation to Frere's madness. This story stands out for various reasons. So far, the film has been very English, set in and around London and the home counties. A significant portion of the story is set on the continent with Americans, and to see an African American owner of a successful establishment is rare and progressive for a British film in the 1940s. After years of war, this segment is fresh. This is alluring, and the idea of partying for the sake of partying would have been alien to a watcher in 1945. The sets are amazing, suitably glorious, but also show the dark underbelly of show business, and it has an aura of film noir. We also have the mesmerising and enduring performance of Michael Redgrave. Redgrave's first major role was also in Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes, and he couldn't be further removed from the amiable Gilbert Redman. Maxwell Frere is an exhausted, pitiful and haunted man who seems to be in a toxic, homoerotic love triangle where he is mentally abused by an apparent inanimate object. His portrayal is subtle with a hint of tragedy. Redgrave studied for the role extensively, consulting with Britain's top ventriloquist Peter Brough from the radio show Educating Archie. The design of Hugo is the stuff of nightmares and is the prototype of the creepy doll that has now become a stereotype. The combination of Redgrave's subtle performance, his hysterical voice and the way Cavalcanti lit the doll still makes this not only the original but still a highly effective use of the trope. The horror of this story is more psychological, and Van Straten concludes the tale with a probable explanation, though he admits that there are some questions that remain. This sets up the ending of the film. As Craig predicted, Van Straten breaks his glasses and the room transcends into darkness. Craig's dream becomes a nightmare. Tension has been brewing between the architect and the psychiatrist throughout the film, especially as the tales, with the exception of the golfing fable, have raised the stakes in psychological terror. Craig has increasingly become hostile and his mood darkens, asking to be left alone with the psychiatrist. Van Straten, at a disadvantage without his glasses, is strangled by Craig. In an attempt to escape, Craig haphazardly runs into the characters and through the stories that we've heard throughout the film, eventually coming face to face with the terrifying Hugo. The sequence comes to an abrupt end as we hear a phone ringing and we see Walter Craig wake up in bed. This whole section is genuinely terrifying, with its manic editing, menacing and melodramatic performances with sneering grins and grotesque makeup. The segment is very reminiscent of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Carnival of Souls, and is a wonderfully grotesque perversion of the characters and the stories that we have come to know throughout the duration of the film. Mrs. Craig wakes her restless husband from his disturbed sleep and she asks if he has had another of his dreams. He is vague, clearly doesn't remember much. Craig answers the phone, and Elliot Foley is at the other end of the line, requesting that the architect's presence for a potential job at a residence called Pilgrim's Cottage. Walter Craig hangs up the phone and wonders why the name seems familiar. The shot stays with Melvyn Johns before it slowly transcends to the opening shot from the start of the film, when we see a groggy, confused Walter Craig drive towards Pilgrim's Cottage and meet Elliot Foley. Thus the dream begins again. It's been said that the closing moments and credits were initially a mistake by a projectionist, muddling up one of the reels. Whether this is true or not, the ending of the film is chilling as we realise Walter Craig is stuck in a never-ending nightmare. Over the coming decades, the portmanteau would become a staple of the horror genre, from those produced by Amicus in the 1960s to Creepshow, The Twilight Zone and Tales of the Crypt. And while not the first, Dead of Night would set the standard. This film is very much a product of its time. It feels very British, but despite its age, despite the plummy accents, it's still a film where there's a sense of impending doom and the audience are not rewarded with a happy, clarifying conclusion. Ealing was a studio that very much wanted to lay out what they believed a post-war Britain should look like, and the idea of being stuck in a cycle of repeating mistakes, that this was an opportunity to change the status quo. The idea of the familiar world being turned upside down and the notion of a never-ending nightmare would have had specific meaning to an audience recently traumatised by the Second World War. There are many characters that are in a state of exhaustion, that are recovering or trying to wake up, that find it hard to comprehend what's happening to them. 75 years on, in 2020, the idea of a recurring, never-ending nightmare speaks to us more than ever.